Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva's motto when addressing international audiences since winning the 2022 presidential election has been to say that Brazil is back. And indeed, Lula used his UN General Assembly address to display his foreign policy agenda and concerns, breaking with his predecessor Jair Bolsonaro, who used the forum to target Brazilian domestic audiences with local culture wars. So in a nutshell, Lula touted Brazilian efforts in environmental and social policy and pointed the finger at developed nations for the failures of global governance bodies. And as expected, he defended the reform of bodies such as the International Monetary Fund and the UN Security Council, where developing nations remain massively underrepresented. My name is Gustavo Ribeiro, editor-in-chief of the Brazilian Report, and this is Brazil This Week. So this week, to comment on Lula's speech and meetings with U.S. President Joe Biden and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, I'm joined by Bruna Santos, the director of the Woodrow Wilson Center's Brazil Institute in Washington, D.C. Bruna, glad to have you back with us. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Gustavo, for the invitation. I'm thrilled to be here with you again.
So, Bruna, you were in New York for the UN General Assembly. Before we delve into the specifics of Lula's speech and other aspects of his visit to New York, can I ask you for a sort of general assessment of Lula's remarks? What did you make of it, and what did the international community that was gathered in New York make of it?
Sure. And yeah, I think this trip was another chapter in this Brazil is Back book that Brazil's President Lula is writing. As we know, initially Lula's presidency showed great promise and goodwill and received a lot of goodwill from the international community. But due to several diplomatic missteps throughout the months, many people doubted it. Many people doubted that he would fulfill the expectations set by this Brazil is Back narrative. So this was a moment, I think, this trip to New York, this mission to New York with a large delegation was overall positive, a positive chapter in this book, and gave the world a much more clarity about Lula's stance. I think one of his objectives clearly was to impress the world and show a united Brazil. I think the presence of both congressional leaders in the delegation, worth mentioning, both Pacheco and Lira were there, the president of the Senate and the president of the lower house. I think it demonstrated that, the strength of this narrative that Lula wanted to show investors in the international community of a united Brazil. Also, the idea to revamp U.S. Brazil relations by launching the global initiative to advance the rights of working people around the world were successful. And finally, he met with Zelensky. This goal, I think, was a risky one for this trip. We didn't know if they were making it since last time they had to cancel. And in the morning yesterday, Lula had to cancel a commitment at the climate summit due to his pain on his hip. So there were questions until it happened. We were all waiting to see if it would happen or not. And apparently it was positive, I think. It was positive. One thing worth saying, and I really want to mention, is to give a little bit of context, of background to this trip. Lula's speech was delivered in a shrinked General Assembly. The UN chief emphasized that the importance of international cooperation in a world that is facing many challenges and so forth. But he also mentioned how hard it's been to convene all the leaders together. Worth saying that only one of the 5 key world powers attended to this meeting. Putin, of course,
Biden is just next door, right? He lives in Washington.
Yeah,
The
he was
UN
the
is in
host.
New York, so it's not a big trip.
He was the host, so he took a train. No, he didn't take the train, I think, but he was like, yeah, he was the host basically, like in his country. So I think, and yeah, again, in this world, presence or absence are loud messages. So
Mhm.
we have to note that no, only one member of the permanent members of the Security Council was there, and also we are living in a world where we have like the highest number of violent conflicts since 1945. So the absence of four of them is a loud message, in my opinion.
Of course. And I mean, we commented during the week about the speech, and you talked about it to our newsletter this week. And we were saying that there were no curveballs, right? I mean, what Lula said before the General Assembly is what he has been saying for months, defending more representation for the global South, banging the drum of fighting poverty and inequality. The fact that, I mean, it was pretty much the same messaging that he has is not necessarily bad, right? I mean, nobody goes to the General Assembly expecting to be surprised. It's actually a commitment to a sort of principles, right? So it was just Lula stating to a very global audience what he will aim in terms of foreign policy, right?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. Well, many observers of Brazil here in the U.S. they thought even those who were critical to the president, they found his speech very agreeable. Like it was particularly like very well received by people that are not necessarily in favor of many of Lula's stance. But it was clear speech. I think he made his message very even like the message, for example, about Snowden, or the message he gave about the fact that he mentioned Ukraine after mentioning other number of conflicts around the world. All
And
that
also
I
that
think
he
was very well
used
framed.
and the way
Sorry.
that he talked about the war in Ukraine, about the fact that permanent members of the Security Council stage wars that are not authorized can describe the U.S. invasion of Iraq just as much as the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Right?
Yeah, I think that the Iraq was definitely part of the message there. Definitely, like we saw Celso Amorim's fingerprints in it, and and again, I think that the way it was framed was better than previous statements that he made about the war. Two, I think the context helped. As I said, like the argument that of need to a Security Council reform to recover its legitimacy. I think it all, like the context, the fact that four of them were not there, I think it helped him in it helped the fact that he mentioned other like military coups in Africa and so forth. I think it helped him in reinforcing the statement and positioning as a leader of the global South in that context.
No, of course, the General Assembly is the main event, but whenever we have this massive gathering of world leaders, we have a slew of other events involving officials of several governments, current and former leaders. And you attended several of these events, namely with Finance Minister Fernando Haddad and Environment Minister Marina Silva of Brazil. What did you make of it outside of Lula at the General Assembly? What did you make of the Brazilian presence in New York this week?
Well, I think so. For talking about Marina and climate first, and then the Minister of Finance, I think I think the tone set by Lula in his speech, bringing inequality not only as social justice matter, but also something that is reflected in the engines of multilateral institutions, including the World Trade Organization, for example. I think it was always there whenever Marina or Haddad were speaking. So I think that climate justice was a big part of Marina's remarks in other convenings where she took part beyond the official like UN headquarters. I think also Brazil had some results to show in terms of deforestation. That was like a big splash, especially because we have to remember that we are comparing Lula's remarks and Marina's presence to last year Bolsonaro. So there is a lot of like the international community was really happy to see them there. And Marina was as applauded as Lula and vouched when she mentioned the fact that deforestation dropped by nearly half in this first 8 months of his government.
Yeah,
but
just a
of course,
caveat that I think it's important. It's that it is quite impressive, the reduction in deforestation rates in the Amazon, but we are seeing other biomes seeing deforestation rates creeping up, especially the Cerrado Savannah, right, which is one of Brazil's newest and most flourishing agricultural frontiers.
Totally. And one thing I felt like in some of the events, especially with people that are committed to this environmental agenda for quite a while already, is that Brazil also needs to guarantee economic alternatives to populations living in those areas. So we are now seeing, of course, drops in the deforestation levels, but it's basically law enforcement, right? So you need also to have a better understanding about what is how Brazil is also preserving the Amazon, preserving other biomes, and also creating a true ecological transformation plan beyond with more specifics and clarity than what's being presented by Haddad and Marina, like on how they are also like fostering or paying for preservation actions in those biomes. It's really important, and also creating an environment and regulating markets, carbon market, green hydrogens, and so forth to attract investments for that. So I think there are in certain forums a more I would say specialized forum, not as general as the UN General Assembly. Many demands were made about that, and that's important to mention.
And
Gives more pressure to.
No, of course. And how was it received when on yesterday, on Wednesday, Marina Silva formalized that Brazil changed its climate goals, and because during the Jair Bolsonaro administration, Brazil gave itself more leeway to emit carbon dioxide, and then Marina Silva announced that Brazil is reestablishing the 2015 commitment that we made during the Paris Agreement as our benchmark, that Brazil will reduce as much as it had promised to reduce in terms of carbon emissions by 2030. So how was that received as well? On top of those measurable results in Amazon deforestation that they already can show for, but also a promise for the next few years?
I think it's seen obviously as it's good to see them being ambitious. I think we have to, right? We are talking about $1 trillion problem. So we have to, so I think it was well received because of the ambition, the increase in the climate ambition. I think it's worth mentioning that a lot of that was made because of civil society pressure. So it was a win for everyone. But obviously, there are different sectors of government that now need to internalize that. And that's one important element, because I think that the lack, whenever you go to Brazil and talk to people and see how they are coordinating the efforts, both for the climate agenda or the new ecological transformation plan, you always get this sense that there is a lack of core of government coordinating those efforts there. You get the sense that one part of government is going in one direction, the other not necessarily. So I think that the civil society and especially the environmental community, people that are like fighting for that for years, they will keep demanding more ambition and more coordination and more results and the engagement of other sectors in government. And so that's the perception I have between this group. But obviously, like, going to like the increase in this and the ambition that is reflected in the NDC, I think it was positive, obviously.
And what about Haddad? Because Haddad talked about many things: the government's fiscal goals, Mercosur, Argentina. What did you make of his showing in New York?
Well, there are two moments, I think. One, I think he did very well in his remarks at the Columbia University event when he could speak he spoke like longer than I thought he would. He spoke about the EU Mercosur agreement and the fact that we do have a window of opportunity that is very short, and we should take advantage of that before the elections in Argentina. He made it very clear and bluntly. He spoke that we should get it done before. Also, that he provoked the European Union on thinking small about the future of the world and how Brazil and Mercosur and the European Union could leverage the treaty to gain more space in negotiations in this competition between U.S. and China, which I thought was a great remark because he called to action, right? Come on, let's solve problems, like think big and close this and think about the future, not necessarily our protectionist agendas. Also, one thing that made me really happy that he brought it to the conversation in that speech is when he mentioned the IRA and how IRA is, in fact, not necessarily the whole idea and strategy that the IRA and the U.S. chips did is not necessarily fostering more integration across the hemisphere. As we all know, the fact that IRA created the precedent to only provide subsidies for production or extraction or processing of, for example, critical minerals in countries where the U.S. has a free trade agreement is a limitation. And it definitely, he mentioned also one of some remarks made by government officials in the U.S. where they literally mentioned that they would not comply to the World Trade Organization commitments if that was a matter of national security. So he was calling again, people calling again for the fact that, okay, maybe we need to rediscuss institutions and frameworks that we created after the Second World War, including the World Trade Organization, and think how we can find a common ground to address this vision of, okay, decoupling and national security for the U.S., but at the same time not creating extra costs and being even more problematic in limiting the energy transition and the low carbon transition of economy. So I thought that was a really good remark that he made. I was not expecting the IRA to come in his speech, and I was really surprised. I think was a very positive appearance. Also, I think you all heard that Fiesp hosted a dinner with all members of government and a number of business representatives, Google, different funds, and so forth on Monday, I think. Yeah, it was a Monday evening. And I think that was also a moment when Brazil and Lula could by bringing Lira and Pacheco, demonstrate a united front to pass the tax reform, a united front to guarantee that the new fiscal framework is going to be all right. And
No, yes, and just as a piece of context, because you mentioned the urgency that Haddad said that we need to pass the deal, the free trade deal, before Argentina goes to the polls, because in Argentina's primaries, far-right libertarian Javier Milei, he scored the most votes, 36%, give or take. And he says he wants to implode Mercosur, that Lula is not welcome in Argentina if he's president, and that he wants to break with China. So yeah, a lot of turmoil can come from Brazil's southern neighbor if Milei is elected. And now, Bruna, after speaking before the General Assembly, Lula met with several world leaders. That include Joe Biden and Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine. So let's talk about the Biden meeting first. Both presidents, they launched an initiative to protect workers' rights. Let's remember, Lula cut his political teeth as a union leader in the 70s, and Biden describes himself as the, quote, most pro-union president in American history. Now, more than that, Lula said that his return to the presidency also means a rebirth in Brazil-U.S. relations. And that comes despite the fact that Brazil has made, under Lula, has taken several positions that are not aligned with Washington. Still, do you think we can say that Biden and Lula, they know where they see eye to eye, where they don't see eye to eye, so they can just focus their bilateral relationship on the things where they have common ground?
Yeah, I think, and I think their hearts are in the same place when it comes to labor and climate. Honestly, and I think, like, if you put into perspective, like, they are both like politicians who have achieved a number of success in their career. They ran for president again. Lula, in the case of Lula, in the case of Biden, he was already a successful politician, and they came into government in the end of their careers, I would say, and as people who are they want to leave a legacy that actually, like, they see themselves in it. They came as saviors of democracy in both countries. They face very similar antagonists in both countries. They are in very similar positions, I think. And when it comes to labor, is something that it's important for Biden. It's something that he's recognized for as a president that is indeed characterized as the most pro-union administration in American history. I think the same for Lula. You already mentioned his past and everything. I disagree. This is the rebirth of Brazil-U.S. relations. I think that's too much. I think it never died. It obviously has its hiccups, and it has its problems. It never leaves to the potential it has. But this initiative does inaugurate a new chapter in a new element, a new blueprint for Brazil-U.S. relations. I think that's important to mention. And as you said, I think the fact that, as Celso Amorim said in one of his, I think, interviews, I don't know if it was at the Washington Post or somewhere else, he said, Brazil is a very good friend of the United States. We don't need to agree on everything. So we are not allies. That's what he's saying. But we are good friends, and we know where we have common ground and where we don't have. However, one of the things that I would say is very important to mention is, one, the U.S. foreign policy discourse has often viewed, like, Latin America as a source of problems, not a source of solutions for many problems. So, as a place of drugs, of illegal immigration, not necessarily recognizing the potential of this relationship. I think the case of Biden is different, but we do have a risk with the next election in the U.S. So there is a window of opportunity also for Brazil, with many challenges, but also many opportunities with this bilateral relation. Two is, I always emphasize that I think that the democratic governance should be at the center of the bilateral relation. Trade should be as well, but I think that more fundamentally, it's really important to note that Brazil-U.S. relations stumbles and its successes happen amid an overarching crisis of democratic institutions, and that Brazil and the U.S. have the challenge to show the world that democracies can deliver. And that's something that we should discuss beyond representation, beyond discussing the institutional crisis. We have also to discuss the delivery crisis that both democratic nations face. And that's not something that I've seen clarity in the agenda yet.
Now, before we move to the next topic, I'd just like to remind everyone who's watching to go to the Brazilian Reports website. You can subscribe to our content. We live off subscriptions. So go to Brazilian.report/subscribe, and you can get exclusive content every day on your inbox or on our website. And if you are already a subscriber, then I ask you to go the extra mile and actually support us on Buy Me a Coffee. You can buy one of our journalists a cup of coffee. You can have different types of memberships. Just go to buymeacoffee.com/Brazilian Report, or you can flash the QR code on the bottom right end of your screen, buymeacoffee.com/Brazilian Report, and you can help our journalism remain independent. Now, Bruna, let's go to one of the most anticipated meetings for those covering Lula's trip to New York, which was his meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky. And as you alluded at the beginning of our conversation, it was a meeting that took a lot of time to actually happen. Both Zelensky and Lula were in Japan for the G7 summit. They did not agree on a time slot to meet, and both sides blamed the other for not managing to find the right time. Then Lula and Zelensky had a video conversation in March. They came with very different summaries of what was discussed. Of course, Lula's remarks on the war in Ukraine vexed the Ukrainian government. Lula suggested that Ukraine should just yield Crimea to Russia in the name of peace. Said that Zelensky was as much to blame for the war as Vladimir Putin. But then they finally met in person. So both sides this time came with very similar words about what happened, saying that it was a very friendly conversation, that it was a positive step to strengthen the bilateral relation. What did you make of it?
Well, I really hope that Crimea was not like a topic there. That would be an embarrassment for Lula. But I think the meeting was more like, I'd call ice breaking, or just like some an honest conversation between both, so they could look eye to eye and see that they have an honest conversation. I think that both presidents obviously have understandings that are totally different about certain matters, but I do believe that it was a chance for Lula to understand the Ukrainian position. Also, I think that being received and having Lula talking to him was important for Brazil's foreign policy, for Lula himself. However, as I've said like a couple other times, I think the window of opportunity for Lula, or as a leader of the global South, to take to have a role in moderating or brokering peace for this war, I think is gone. I don't see it happening anymore. Because of the mistakes he made in the past. But it was good that they saw each other. It was good that Lula could actually had a real conversation with Zelensky. I think it was ice-breaking. I think, as you said, they both came out with clear messages from both Dmytro Kuleba and the Minister of Foreign Relations of Brazil, Mauro Vieira. So they all agreed that it was a not warm and honest conversation. That's a good thing. However, yeah, again, I think that the whole idea of Lula speaking about Ukraine after mentioning other conflicts in the world is a message that, okay, the global South matters. Maybe we shouldn't be speaking or giving so much focus to this proxy war between Russia and the U.S. and looking at other conflicts that are happening around the world, and other challenges such as climate justice and migration and so forth. So I think that was basically the message. But it would be a risk. I think that they tried to diminish Zelensky importance, I would say, at this point, for when they stated how weak he is right now. I think just to diminish also the risk of not being received by the Ukrainian president.
That's saying that among certain emerging powers in notably Brazil, there's this sort of Ukraine fatigue. of sorts, like, this is not a priority for us, this is not our war, and we're just, to put it like, we're just tired of this protagonism that has been given to Zelensky. Giving our full-fledged support to the Ukrainian cause does not necessarily bring us much in return. Do you agree with that assessment? Do you think that this is a fair way to put how Brazil and how other emerging countries see the war in Ukraine?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially when it comes to like effects that this war brought to the world in food prices, energy prices, the economic situation in Europe that is being like impacted because of the war. I think it's fair to say that the global South has a fair position. It's not. I'm not saying that it's not legitimate. What I'm saying is, it is a conflict that matters to the world. Obviously, that matters a lot for China, for Russia, for the U.S., for Europe. And it's not a matter of diminishing its importance, but it's also a matter of bringing that to a table that is more complex for countries like Brazil. So I think it's reasonable to say that, and I think it's good when leaders can like have a grown-up conversation and discuss those priorities and what is at stake for Brazil, what is at stake for Ukraine, and maybe take a more cautious narrative and rhetoric whenever talking about it. I think that's something that we may expect from Lula from now on.
Now, before we wrap this up, do you think that there's something that we might not have discussed? It is important for us to address before we call it a day?
No, I just want to say, like, honestly, I think it's great to have presidential diplomacy back. I think it's great to have Brazil's leadership on climate, on this new agenda for labor. Let's see what comes after. But it's really important to put into perspective that, for example, the attention that Lula's speech had in the national media was really great and really high, but not necessarily the same happened in the international media. So I heard narratives like, oh, Lula dominated the UN General Assembly. That this one was a shrinked one, and also that's not necessarily true. I think Brazil has its importance, but it also can sometimes be hyperactive and overestimate our successes, which is probably because the president predecessor was such was a person that no one necessarily respected in those environments. So that's one of the reasons. But I think we need to keep humble and understand where we have advantages and where we do not have. So.
Well, with that reality check, I think we can wrap things up. Bruna, thank you very much for your insights. Glad to have you on.
Thank you.
And I hope to have you back very soon.
Thank you. Very good to be here. Bye-bye.
Have a good one. Bye-bye.